Well, here we are at the fourth fourth tape of the theory of process. Welcome. This time we're going to cover man. It's probably the most difficult, but I hope it'll be the most interesting. Let's go back a bit. We have in this concept of process a way of not only providing an abstract framework, but incorporating a great deal of data that to science would not have much meaning. First, let's talk about the abstract overview. We start with purpose, and to get to a goal, purpose has to have means. To get the means, it has to descend into matter. What does that mean? It means find something determinate that it can build on. It must also have what you could call motivation, motive power, and navigational ability. So in these stages, purpose, getting the motivation, the navigating power through mind, the determinate matter, it then can regain its original freedom and achieve its goal. I won't go over all the details of this arc, but think of it in that single framework that of purpose getting means to achieve the end, and the means have to be determinate. But in so doing, we also took in a large sweep of data. Of course, what I have here is the data of physics. Here it comes from biology. And by the substages, we're able to look at each one of these stages in detail and find things that help fill in the gaps of the other stages. Now, I think it might pay to shift over to a diagram that's a little more abstract. We can always keep this in mind, but remember that this is one example. This is the universe as displayed in the kingdoms. But if we take the essence of each kingdom, then we have the key words. Potential, binding, identity, combination, growth, mobility, and dominion. Now these words are of course tentative. We have to have some words. For example, binding, which is one of the most difficult things to give a word to, could be various things like attraction, charge, substance, value. One of the most interesting words for this stage is illusion. You could say, what has illusion got to do with binding? Well, you could say it's the illusion that binds you to something. If you go into a movie and you're late, you don't have the illusion, you're not plugged in, you're not stuck to it. Another reference is the German word spielen. Spielen means to tell a story, but the same word, the same root provides the word spell, to tell a story or to cast a spell. It's really the same thing, because you have to capture the audience. this is where we're captured, where we're caught, bound, or caught by illusion. If you like, it's karma. The identity stage which follows is when we're able to separate ourselves from the illusion, begin to make comparisons. At stage 2, we fall in love. At stage 3, we say, well, do I love her as much as I love the other girl? You start comparing. Once you're comparing, you've cut yourself off from the direct charge and are putting it in a conceptual framework. This is precisely what the proton and the electron do. At this point, they're interacting directly. At this point, they're wrapped up, and you can separate them from the rest of the complex of experience. So with those two tools, you're then able to tackle this combination stage, which is the combination of identity and binding, and find out if your conceptual, if the theory, the concept, the way you approach it is correct. And when, by interaction here, you can finally correct it and come into the growth, and so on to mobility. Now, we have all this sweep of data, and we have this abstract scheme, but even though, with all this, it's still very helpful to go to myth, which tells the story so simply. I think it might be interesting to cover some of these myths. It's unfortunate that they're not better known. In fact, it's even hard to find them in the literature. You look up a book on myth, and the author has generally chopped it up into small pieces, and he wants to illustrate some theory. Well, of course, I'm illustrating a theory too, but I do it by looking at the whole myth. Perhaps the nearest, well, not the nearest either, but let me start with the Greek myth of Chronos. It begins with Mother Earth, Gaia. Gaia is being impregnated by Father Sky, Uranus, and is giving birth to so many forms that she's sick and tired of it. And she persuades her son Chronos, she gives him a sickle and persuades him to cut off the testicles of Uranus, his father. And Chronos does so and rules in place of Uranus. But Chronos anticipates that he may himself be displaced by his son, so he makes a rule that he'll eat his own children. There's a famous painting of Goya showing Chronos eating his children. Well, let's stop just for a minute. What does this mean? It all sounds very brutal. Well, Chronos is time, as in chronometer. Time limits, time, things born in time have to end in time. So it's the principle of time that Gaia invoked to cut down this profligate generation of forms. We say, if we have a lot of things to do, we say, give me time. You have to sort things out and do them in some kind of order. Well, the universe itself needed that ordering principle in order to sort itself out. Well, the predicament is now that Chronos eats his own children. So Rhea, the wife of Chronos, doesn't like this, so she, when she gives birth to Zeus, wraps a stone in swaddling clothes and presents it to Chronos in place of Zeus. And Zeus is able to escape. And of course Zeus then has his own progeny. He was noteworthy for his great many progeny. But let's check that on the ark. Unfortunately, the Greek myth doesn't tell us about the first stage, but the second stage is illustrated by Mother Earth, the substance principle. Uranus, who is the sky god, what's that got to do with identity? Well, the sky is that which goes around us and makes this circle, which makes us the center, and hence separate from the rest of the universe. I was surprised to find Eddington, the great 20th century mathematician and physicist, using uranoid as the word for environment. He was the first scientist to say that you can't think of a mountain all by itself. You have to think of the mountain in a setting. And the setting for him was the uranoid. How did he get there? Well, I have not seen the word in the dictionary, but uranoid would derive from the word Uranus, meaning sky. In other words, the surround, the environment, which gives the thing its identity. Well, the combination, which is also regulation, because it's when you combine things that you have to have rules. The regulation of Chronos, which limited the life he was going to eat his children. Now, what did Rhea do? She recognized the law. Remember I said that recognition of the law was the way to escape. And because she recognized the law and complied with it by feeding Chronos the stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, Jupiter, growth, was able to escape. Now, I had a friend who said, but that wasn't kosher. It's not a moral problem at this stage. This turn, it has moral implications, but the real essence is seeing how things work and recognizing that it's to your own advantage to not keep on going down, to escape from this descent into determinism. Someone called this inscape, because it's not so much escape in that you get more space, but you take advantage of what you have. I want to try a few more myths. Maybe I better just tell you the myths and leave out the interpretation. The Egyptian myth tells about Set, who was a sort of bad guy, and he plotted the downfall of his brother Osiris. Osiris was the god who represented man. So he planned a great party, invited all the gods, and prepared in advance this beautiful casket made of gold studded with jewels, and he was going to give it to whichever god it would fit. Of course, he'd made it in advance to the dimensions of Osiris, so when Osiris got in, he fitted. And Set clamped on the lid, and the casket floated down the Nile. The attraction to the casket And the binding is evident from that, because it's already imposing one constraint. The casket floated down the Nile and came to the foot of the tamarisk tree, which grew up enfolding it. And the tree eventually was cut down and used in the palace of the king. Then Isis, the mate or syzygy of Osiris, who had been looking for him, heard about the beautiful perfume in the palace of the king, and she suspected that this was Osiris. And she went there to rescue Osiris, and Set, of course, heard about this and cut up Osiris into 14 pieces and scattered them in the marsh. Well, it goes on to say that Isis went around picking up the pieces. She found all of them except the phallus. She reassembled the pieces and from the corpse conceived the infant Horus. The infant Horus grew up to be a hero and did great deeds and conquered Set. Then he rose and became the sun god. Horus is the sun god in Egypt, shown with a head of a hawk. The hawk is used because it's the bird that flies highest, nearest the sun. I think it's a very powerful myth. I'll wait, let you think about it. Of course, we have our own myth, Genesis 2, God first created Adam, and Adam wasn't quite contented, so they created Eve. Eve, incidentally, created from Adam's rib. It's something like the pair creation that we referred to in particles, because the pair creation creates these two things from one, which, because they're separate, then are strongly attracted to each other. But basically, Eve is the desiring principle, the desire principle. Eve is the mother of all living, it says in the Bible. The desire principle was the source of everything manifest. Well then, the third stage, of course, was the tree. The Garden of Eden was the tree that they were forbidden to eat. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That would be this intellectual thing, the capacity to think. But it's very much a very essential part of this was that it be forbidden. Why? Because since it was forbidden, their decision to eat was their own decision. In their eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the really important thing is their disobedience, you see. This is what gave them the identity. And of course, then they were banished into the world. They had to take on skins. That would really mean that they had to have bodies. They enter the world of toil and stress. And that's as far as the Adam and Eve myth carries us. It isn't till Christ that we get the turn with the virgin birth. And then Christ going through the heroic phase, and the crucifixion of Christ would probably come in here, and his triumph over death, which carried him to sit on the right hand of God. The triumph over death, we'll get into that more later. There's one other myth that is invaluable, the Popol Vuh myth. This is the myth that was recorded by a monk when the Pizarro came over and conquered the Incas, or the Incas. It tells about the two twins playing ball in heaven. And the 12 princes of Xibalba called on the princes to take their initiation. And they had to take their initiation in 7 caves. I don't remember all the initiations, but they failed the first one because they mistook an idol for a god. As punishment for failing their initiations, their heads were cut off and placed in the calabash tree. Then the scene shifts to the Princess Ixquic, who heard about the remarkable fruit of the tree of the calabash tree and went to pluck some. And as she reached out her hand to pluck the fruit, the hand spat in her palm and said, the head spat in her palm and said, "That is my progeny. Now I can die." Of course, when the Princess Ixquic got home, she was pregnant, and the father refused to accept this story and ordered that she be sacrificed. But she persuaded her executioners to spare her and replace her, instead of her heart, give the fruit of the calabash tree, which was the same color. And she gave birth to the twins again. And the twins became heroes and did great deeds and passed their initiations. All except the last cave, the second twin had his head cut off, but that didn't bother them because by this time the first one had magical powers and put his head on again. That's a reference here to this transcending life and death. Then comes the stage that is so well described in Popol Vuh and neglected in the others. They became itinerant magicians and went around doing magical acts and cutting each other up and putting each other back together again. And the 12 princes of Xibalba heard about them and asked that they come and perform. So they did, and they made the castle of the princes disappear, and then they brought it back again, and they made the little dog disappear, and they brought it back again. And the princes were really intrigued, and they said, "Could you make us disappear and bring us back again?" "Yes," the twins said, "we will," and they did. They made them disappear, but they didn't bring them back, and the twins became the sun and moon, reaching this 7th stage. But now let me look back. Notice that the initiation again was illusion. They were deluded by the statue to think it was a god. The identity stage is represented again by the tree. The heads were placed in a tree. What is a tree? We use the word family tree when we mean a whole lot of different relationships. I suspect that the tree is a symbol representing the intellect, which all these relationships, reaching out and touching everything, correspond to branches in the tree. Well, of course, we had the virgin birth in the Popol Vuh because the spit was the basis of the birth, and it's a different kind of virgin birth, and it's sufficiently different so that one wasn't copying the other. And of course, we have the hero stage here. And what I like best of all, the magical stage here. Now, why is magic second level? It's because this is being caught by illusion. The magician is one who creates illusion. In other words, what is one is a victim of here, one uses to victimize here. This is the power of magic. Well, I think those myths are really wonderful, and they guide you through the whole thing without getting lost in the formulas and details. They're like a compass. Science provides a very accurate map. Everything is in its right place. All the relationships spelled out, good, well formulated. But think how useless a map would be if you didn't know which was north. You have all this information in front of you, but you don't know where to go. It's myth that provides the compass. And the compass is just as important as the information. If you had the map upside down, you'd be going the wrong direction, and so on. Well, now we've got our basis. Let's try to think of man. Where is modern man in this scheme? And let's say, what are the stages in terms of man? Well, I think we've already indicated them so far that the identity stage, so far as man is concerned, is ego. And the creation of the ego, the realization of separateness, is well recognized in this society. We all automatically think of ourselves as separate beings. Much more primitive races didn't do that. They were all communicating with one another by ESP. They thought of the tribe, they thought of the family as the same as themselves. For instance, you get some of that in the old Mosaic law, eye for eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, if one of the tribe was injured or shot by another tribe, then someone in that tribe had to lose their life. It didn't matter who. It was the whole body had to suffer the same amount that the first body did. There wasn't a tracing of guilt to an individual person. So I would think that modern man has passed this stage. In fact, I would think of this stage as beginning, say, in Greece, when they began to question the authority of the gods and to think for themselves. You see, just as Adam and Eve started to think for themselves at this identity stage. In fact, I'd like to believe that man has reached this stage and is now at the turn. One of the reasons for saying this is that he is so concerned with law, not only the laws of physics and science, but making legislation and making laws about everything. Now there's a new spat of laws with all these labels and kind of tops on bottles and pollution and laws, and they get so complicated that some companies just give up because they can't keep track of the bureaucracy. So the turn, if it's true that we're at the turn, then it's very important to have some kind of restoration of religion. Even if it's only a religion of recognizing that determinism ain't it. I just heard about a TV program starting yesterday where Carl Sagan said that there was no evidence whatever that the mind was not in the brain. Well, it's this kind of brainwashing that we need to transcend. And this theory should be able to help, because I'm answering science in its own terms. If science says that man is merely a machine, I reply, have you ever seen a machine that didn't have a purpose? And if the scientists say, yes, but the purpose of the machine is not in the machine, it's something that man puts there, well, then that's an admission that you wouldn't expect to find purpose by looking at the machine. And no more could you expect to find mind by looking at the brain. The brain is a machine that purpose has put together for the purpose of communicating and navigating and working through the world. Speaking of navigating reminds me of the Chinese story of man's predicament. I've given you a great many myths, but here's another. The Chinese, it's really more a metaphor than a myth. The state of man is like a horse and carriage. The carriage is broken. The horse is wandering around eating grass. The driver is drunk, and the owner's asleep. Now these four elements correspond to the four levels. The carriage is the material object, and that's broken. The driver is drunk, that's the intellect that would navigate. The horse that provides the motivation is wandering around eating grass. And the owner, which would be the first stage, is asleep. So what needs to happen is for the horse to be put back in the harness, the driver sober up, and the carriage get repaired, and the owner wake up. Then we have this side. This would be the state of affairs when everything was working. Well, perhaps that's enough myth, but they very plainly tell you, I could tell you many more. Always these levels, and often the separate aspects of spirit, soul, mind, and body. Now, spirit and soul are quite different, because spirit is the original purpose. Soul is the experiencing thing that endures through time. I think we said that already. This is spirit and this is soul. Well, to meet the onslaught of science, which reminds me of another myth, the Persian myth, that the god Mazda is light, created these pieces of himself, these particles of light that he sent out to fight the powers of darkness. This is exactly what's happening here. These photons go out and enter the world of manifestation, the power of darkness. And science now is our power of darkness. So we need to have some light thrown on this subject of science. And one very critical area is this question of evolution. Sometimes I wish that people could study phony subjects, or allegedly phony subjects. Say, for instance, astrology or Egyptian secret wisdom in the Egyptian pyramid and so on, where I'm not saying that these subjects are phony, but when one goes into these subjects, one learns to be on guard and suspect phony reasoning, or one develops a nose for phoniness. And then you can go back to science and find all the places where this allegedly authoritative and expert doctrine has holes. And one of the holes is the Darwin theory of evolution. It's said to explain evolution. Well, it's perfectly true that in order to survive, things have to be fit. You might say survival is a necessary condition for evolution. But that doesn't explain how these higher and higher forms of organization occurred in the first place. In other words, if a horseshoe crab is fit, and it must be pretty fit to survive for the millions of years that it survived, why should it attempt to avoid being a horseshoe crab? Why should it venture out from under this shell and evolve to higher forms? This goes on right along the line. Why does a snail come out of its shell and try to be a worm? Why does the worm sprout legs? If a form is adequate, then it would survive. You wouldn't need a higher form. The worst of all is how did the bird come about? Here's a creature that gave up the use of two of its legs and had to dedicate them to trying to learn how to grow wings. And this took millions of years. I think a conservative estimate would be 50 million years it took to develop the wing. But it wasn't only the wing. The whole anatomy of the bird had to change. Hollow bones, a special breathing system that would enable more oxygen, feathers, higher blood temperature. All of these things had to coordinate, and if they were due to accidental mutation of genes, then they would have had to occur together to be useful. Just having one without the other wouldn't enable the creature to survive. So we have to question the whole concept of evolution, and the theory we're proposing here is primarily that evolution is a built-in feature of the universe, because the universe tends to go to higher and higher levels of organization. Now, to demand, one way to look at it would be to think in terms of atoms. Do the complicated atoms evolve from the simpler atoms? Well, they must have evolved somehow. First you had the simpler atoms, and then you had the more complicated atoms. But was it survival of the fittest that made them evolve? That shows how ridiculous that idea is. One of the important principles in atomic theory is what's known as the Pauli exclusion principle. In other words, it's to put it very simply, it's that the electrons take on their significance from the role they're playing in the game. And the game they play is determined by the formula of the Pauli exclusion principle, which allows more roles as the numbers get higher. And the evolution of the atom is apparently filling in these higher roles, these higher numbers. So you could say the explanation of the higher stages of evolution is filling in these possibilities of organization that lay ahead. This question of man's evolution is of great importance because we're people, we're men. But let me remind you, we already covered the three, you remember the three types of evolution? There was the evolution of the DNA, which went from 3 to 4 to 5, and that's the regular evolution. And there was the evolution of animal instinct, which went from 2 to 4 to 6, based on attraction toward immediate goals. And then there was the type of evolution from 1 to 4 to 7, which was man's evolution of being able to recognize the law, to recognize truth, and incorporate that into his information system and move on, evolve. Well, it's that man evolution that I really want to talk about, and is perhaps the most important thing of all. Because the Darwinian or even the animal evolution, whatever the individual does, doesn't help the what's going to happen. From the point of view of Darwinian evolution, we might as well not do anything at all, because our genes don't change from a very early age and are not influenced by our behavior or our education or our struggles. These struggles don't affect the evolution of the next generation. So we come to the concept, and we're forced to come to the concept, of ourselves as individuals surviving and benefiting from the evolution, from the struggles we've gone through in this life. Now, I'm sorry that this is such an unpopular idea today, this idea of survival of the soul. And I've tried to show that it's perfectly rational, because the soul is not constructed out of things, so it can't be destroyed. It's also the only possible explanation of how you could get this whole sweep of things and get these very complicated entities on this end if they hadn't gone through these stages in their own previous lifetimes. So I'm implying not only that we had many lifetimes as a person, but that we have lived before as an animal, as a vegetable, as a monad for billions of years. We're just as old as the universe. And perhaps we are even much older than the universe, because the universe may have had nights and days, and we have started from the very beginning. Now, suppose we were to think in terms of real people. Take Mozart. How could Mozart possibly spring from nothing? At the age of 4, I think it was, he copied down he remembered the whole Mass of the church that he'd attended and was able to play it after. This was a secret. They didn't allow anyone to know what the music was. But little Mozart, 4 years old, reproduced it after he came home. And at 7, he was writing symphonies. Now, how could that genius, that talent, superb, just spring from nothing? If you believe in miracles, okay, but the rational explanation is that it took a long time to evolve, and that he was many lifetimes before he could be the genius that he was. But it's not only Mozart, and not only all great men. You yourself represent a kind of complexity that's far, far beyond the capability of something from springing from nothing. I said before that each person is trillions of cells, and each cell has the complexity of General Motors, or much greater complexity than General Motors. How could that totality and the organization just spring up in one lifetime? So what this theory does is really explain much more simply, in the sense that it doesn't require these fantastic jumps of creating from nothing. This is how to get from one point to another with the minimum self-explanatory devices. It shows building one step at a time. We get to the freedom of free will in man by the freedoms that have been first to store energy and then to move about for obvious targets within reach, and then the combination of those two where we can reach targets beyond ourselves. So then, to sum up, the whole theory is a way of restoring man in his rightful, restoring to man his rightful heritage. And I'd like to say it's really not a theory at all. It's the way things are.